I'm joined by Steve Mossop, the Executive Vice President at Leger, pollster who's got a new poll out this week on basically a report card on BC politics. And boy, there's a lot in there on John Restad, who's certainly, even though he is not the premier, he is the leader of the opposition. And I think your poll certainly illustrates why he's under increasing pressure from within to resign.
It really does. And, there's never a dull moment in tracking this stuff. We've been tracking for about 5 or 6 years now, even before that, every 6 months. And we talk about new subjects. This time we did the normal government report card, horse race numbers, but we looked at the overall leadership of Rustad and what the general public thinks and where he's fallen short. And so we'll dive right in and talk about some of these findings.
Sure. So just give us an overview. What sort of questions did you ask, and what were
Yeah,
some of the
I'll
big
start with the
takeaways?
overall numbers. Since the election, the BC NDP has widened its lead over the BC Conservatives to 10 points. If an election were held tomorrow, it would be 48% NDP and 38% BC Conservatives. So it really makes the party end up in its strongest position since the 2020 election under John Horgan. We haven't seen higher numbers for the NDP. So kudos to them. They're doing a great job. Conservatives have slipped from their post-election high, and now they're down to their lowest level since then. And with that comes a whole other number of subjects under the hood. If you look at leadership approval ratings, EB's approval rating is quite strong, is at 47%, which for a premier in Canada, in any of the provinces, is quite high. Back in the day, Horgan used to run around those numbers, 47 to 50%, and so he's really followed in that general trend. We have Rustad dropping to 30% approval. It's down 5 points overall, and that's his lowest level since the election. So that's continued to erode. We see more pointed questions about his leadership. Despite the fact that he got a 70% approval, or not approval, confidence vote from party members early this month. The public's opinion is deeply divided. 2/3 of British Columbians actually think he should step down as a leader, so 63% think he should step down, and only 37% think he should stay.
Well, and even amongst those, 46% of people who identify themselves as conservatives say he should go. So that reflects a larger percentage than the 30% who wanted him to go, or at least voted non-confidence.
It's a really interesting point. That's a dramatic difference from the 30% of the current party caucus or the current party members who believe the same. So to some extent, you could accuse them of being a little bit out of touch with their general electorate of the people that support them.
Right. We should say that this poll was conducted a couple of weeks ago, second week of October. So middle of the BCGEU strikes, you'd think the government might even take a bit of a hit over that. People can't get their alcohol, or at least the way they used to.
Yeah, we have done some private polling on that, and there was some waning support. Initially, there's a lot of sympathy these days for unions and for cost of living post-COVID. We've seen almost a reversal of years and years of decline to a point where we look at Canada Post workers, we look at rail strike, we look at different strikes that have happened throughout the country. We've seen this fairly high level of support, even for Alberta teachers. There's more people in favor of the teachers than there are opposed to it, even in a very right-wing environment. So it's no exception here. But at the same time, yeah, as the strike went on, there's some disgruntled consumers out there who are tired of not getting the things they want.
You mentioned the NDP are flying relatively high. Certainly, I think your poll points out that at 48%, it's the highest since 2020 when Horgan was premier, and we know that he was a kind of a populist premier, and EB hasn't been perceived in the same way. How much of this success for EB can be attributed to the dissatisfaction with Rustad as opposed to satisfaction with him?
I would argue that it's really satisfaction with him alone. If you look at the approval ratings of the government on current issues, there's been not a huge shift in public opinion on a number of fronts. So they get great scores for handling wildfires in the summer. They get good scores for managing relations with the federal government, for reconciliation with Indigenous folks in BC, and relations with municipal governments, and prep for U.S. tariffs. So on that list, they've done fairly well. And the only files that they really struggle with are the classic ones of poverty, homelessness, housing prices, and the opioid crisis. So they have held their own in a number of different file categories without the decline of Rustad driving their popularity.
Okay, well, that's good news for him then. Whereas Rustrad, it strikes me it's all bad news. You've got what is it, 49% saying he has extreme political views, and only 30% saying he represents a credible alternative to EB.
That is just one of many stats, and I'll go through them here. If you look at
Yeah.
the impact, we ask people the direct question: with John Rustad leading the Conservative Party of BC, does it make you more or less likely to vote for him? And there's only 18% who say that they're more likely to vote for him. So he does have some supporters, but 40% are saying less likely. And that number is apparent whether you're an NDP voter or a Conservative voter or a Green voter. If you look at the Conservative voters, only 43% say they're more likely to vote for him with him leading. And another 40% say it doesn't really have an impact, but there's a large percentage of that say that it does have less, they're less likely to support the party because of him. And then going through the other numbers, the perception, I talked about the resignation numbers. But if you look at some of the criticisms of him is that 49% believe that he has extreme political views. They tag that in the list, and even among Conservative voters, that's at 34%. On the other hand, on any of the other files, from understanding the issues facing British Columbia, representing change for the status quo, or providing a credible alternative to David Eby and the NDP, he scores quite low on those. So there's not really a bright spot, if you will, in overall numbers that say that he's doing anything really well.
You also break it down by age and by gender. I mean, very interesting when you look at Eby versus Rustad. And we saw this during the last election, I believe, as well. This massive gender gap where they're in a statistical tie, it appears, among male voters, but there's a 19-point gap amongst women in support of Eby.
Yes, let me just pull those numbers out because you're right, it is significant. We look at the age groups, and we have the Conservatives, as you know, appeal to men more than women, like 42% compared to 33. And NDP, it's the flip of that. It's 52% would vote tomorrow for NDP and only 43% of men. And you look at the age categories, the majority support for the Conservative Party is for the 35 plus category, specifically 35 to 54 at 41%. That's their strongest cohort, and then the 55 plus at 37%, a little bit lower. So they know who their prime audience is, and those numbers haven't dramatically changed since the election.
Right. So what would your advice be to the two leaders based on these numbers?
Well, I'm sure EB is quite happy to hear of this. The more conflict there is among the ranks of the Conservatives, the better. And he's going to get that when these numbers come out, and they will, when you publish them. And for John Rustad, he spent a lot of time being very steadfast in his position about I'm staying on. It's only these outliers that are causing friction in the party. But he has to be looking at these numbers. Politicians will always tell you that they don't pay attention to polling numbers. No, they do pay attention to polling numbers. He's going to look at this, and he's going to probably have second thoughts about his approach, is my guess.
Is there anything in these numbers, even in how people feel about the issues, that tell you what kind of an opposition leader might be successful?
It's a tricky one because, we saw federally, one of the reasons that Poilievre didn't get elected is because his hard line, he's too much like Trump label that he got late in the election campaign, or I should say right after the Trump tariffs were announced, he got that label. And so it's a very tricky thing for a Conservative Party leader to maneuver. As soon as you start getting into he's too much like Trump or he's too far right wing, you're going to lose support. And then, but you look at the opposite. Look at our previous leaders in that camp that have taken more of a centrist approach. They lose the right. So I think the overall message to a potential leader of that party is you have to be able to almost cater to both sides without being labeled as too much of a centrist and too much of a right-wing nut. You need to somehow balance those interests and come across as caring, compassionate, but having some values on the conservative side that appeal to the conservative side of voters.
Particularly on the fiscal side. That seems to be the
Well, that's the interesting one that I scratch my head at. When you look at the issues facing British Columbia, deficit spending is really not labeled in the top issues. It just doesn't even show up. And in years past, you think of years past federally, that was a number one issue from the right wing, is to talk about the deficit spending. It shows up in taxes a little bit as the most important issue. It's number 9 on the list. Nobody's really talking about deficit spending, unfortunately, in this day and age.
I guess it shows up indirectly, perhaps, in healthcare and some of the other places because you have less money to spend on those things, and therefore, but it's not related directly to, as you say, deficits.
Yeah, but then you have, an increasing emphasis on healthcare. As inflation has dissipated and interest rates have switched around, you've seen a lessening of that as the number one issue, and reverting back to healthcare as the number 2 issue, clearly relative to what it used to be, like number 3 or 4.
All right. Well, great. Thanks for letting us in on this, Steve, and we'll talk again.
Excellent. Thanks, Harold.